Today we're going to be discussing Emperor Constantine and the marriage of the church to the state. For Christians to ever hope for the establishment of Christianity as the official state religion is a very serious mistake. As a Christian, it would be very tempting to want this to happen, especially in our society today, where it seems like the world is just going to hell in a handbasket. There's moral degradation everywhere we look, and it just seems like it'll be the easiest solution for the government to impose Christianity upon the populace as a whole, and to bring back some type of a semblance of reason, if you will, or morality back to our degenerated society. However, that would be a fatal error that we must learn from the past. Furthermore, we have to look at our example in the Bible, Jesus, who is the founder of Christianity. Never once did he use the government to bludgeon people into submission. Instead, he persuaded people to come to him and to believe in him. We see that this is true of the apostles as well, who would take after the example that Christ left for them to follow. Not once in the Bible is there ever a mention of Christ ever wanting to use the government to coerce people into conversion. From this, we see the perversion that took place in history when Constantine married the church to the state together to create an unrecognizable monster of Christianity. Some of the emperors were content being considered the first citizen of Rome, while others sought to make themselves as a deity. Most notable of those were Domitian and Caligula. Partially, this was to help with any personal shortcomings that they had. Talk about low self-esteem. Or to try to establish their families as the rightful heirs to the throne. Eventually, in 218 AD, Elagabalus attempted to replace Jupiter, or Zeus for those of you who are still in college, as the head god of the Roman pantheon. He tried to replace Jupiter with the Phoenician god Elagabal, who Elagabalus happened to be the high priest of the said cult. However, even his cult was far too extreme even for the Roman heathen. That, compounded with Elagabalus' sexual deviancy, the Romans didn't take too kindly to him. The history of his sexual deviance ranges from him marrying and then divorcing that wife months later just to get a newer model, or choosing men to be on his court just based off of the size of his genitalia and not of his competency. So many modern day men would have claimed to be part of that court. Ladies, don't listen to those guys. Anyway, and Elagabalus was also, shocker, bisexual. Because, of course, what straight man would choose men based off of the size of their genitalia? Eventually, Elagabalus tried to remarry his second wife, and his men had had enough of his sexual deviance, and they killed him at the age of 18. Elagabalus' failed attempt to overthrow Jupiter as the head god of the pantheon ultimately brought about 50 years of civil conflict, as seen in this chart of the amount of emperors and their short-lived regimes. During this 50-year conflict, Emperor Decius comes to power in 249 AD and begins anew the persecution of Christians. As a result, other major cults of Sol Invictus and Mithras also emerged during this time. By the year 284 AD, Diocletian steps onto the scene and divides the Roman Empire into two pieces and establishes himself as a god among men. Diocletian retires in the year of 305 AD, and after a few more emperors in 306 AD, Constantine ascends to the throne and reunifies the Roman Empire and establishes Christianity as the empire's primary religion. Since Christianity is monotheistic, it would place all of that power behind one man and one God. Of course, as stated before, to have one supreme God that would give legitimacy to a man, that was a highly appealing fact. However, there was something about Christianity during this time that other religions lacked. That was tenacity and extreme growth in the face of extreme persecution. No matter how many times the empire tried to stamp out Christianity, it just kept growing. They experienced persecution under Roman Emperor Nero in 64 AD, again under Trajan in 110 AD. They experienced persecution under Decius in 250 AD, but in 250 Emperor Decius attempted to revive the Roman pagan religion and persecute Christians. For almost 40 years, the legalized Christian church flourished in the Roman Empire. Then in 297, Emperor Diocletian initiated one last terrible Christian persecution. And finally, Galerius in 305 AD. Now, Galerius was Diocletian's handpicked successor, and he hated Christians so much he organized a war of extermination against them in the Eastern Empire. Listen to this passage. Christians were mutilated, burned alive, and crucified. Hundreds of Christian men, women, and children were forced to labor in the government mines. Crowds in Roman arenas shouted, "Let there be no Christians." We can clearly see in each one of these passages that Christianity was persecuted multiple times by the Roman Empire, yet the Romans were unable to ever eradicate them. Though there were times when Christians experienced freedom, they did experience growth during that time, but they also continued to grow through the face of extreme persecution. Around the start of the 3rd century, there were roughly 3 million Christians accounted for, which is an impressive feat to grow from 12 apostles and the 120-ish people that met together in Acts chapter 1. Their impressive growth is further evidence in the fact that over 2.8 billion people recognize some form of Christianity as their religion today. In 313, Emperor Constantine made the Edict of Milan, which gave religious freedom for all the people of the Roman Empire, so that we might grant to the Christians and others full authority to observe that religion which each preferred, whence any divinity whatsoever in the seat of the heavens may be propitious and kindly disposed to us and all who are placed under our rule, and thus, by this wholesome counsel and most upright provision, we thought to arrange that no one whatsoever should be denied the opportunity to give his heart to the observance of the Christian religion, of that religion which he think best for himself, so that the supreme deity, to whose worship we freely yield our hearts, may show in all things his usual favor and benevolence. In some ways, this was a landmark for the cause of religious freedom, but as we will soon find out, this could never fully take effect like it has here in America due to the pervasive nature of the Roman Empire. As Ben Hart states in his book Faith and Freedom on page number 37, the old civil religion, paganism, had provided inadequate as a means of social control, and so the state gradually tilted to the direction of Christianity. Christianity to Constantine was a more effective social glue than paganism. Even though Constantine converted over to Christianity, his conversion to most Christians would be dubious at best. He killed his wife and his son, he had his sister's son flogged to death, he had his sister's husband strangled to death, and he still called on the pagan gods, Mars and Apollo, to cure diseases and for good crop yield. Doesn't sound very Christian to me. Due to this evidence, it's far more likely that he used Christianity as a political aid rather than his own personal belief. And to place that sweet, sweet, delectable cherry on top of his already crappy Christian record, he used court splendors to entice bishops to side with him, and they proved to be extremely valuable to him. Listen to this. Constantine began subsidizing Christian churches lavishly out of the treasury and became involved in the appointment of bishops. Due to this incestuous relationship that was born, bishops began to herald Constantine as an angel of God or a divine being, and they in turn were given large sums of money. Through this, we can see the perversion of the church that had taken place, and Christians saw that this newfound freedom and favored treatment had ultimately transformed the once pure doctrine of Christianity into an unrecognizable abomination that Christ would not approve of. Again, to cite Benjamin Hart in his book Faith and Freedom, the church had become increasingly enmeshed in the affairs of the state and high society. It had lost its moral authority. Christianity under Constantine had become hierarchical, full of pomp and pageantry and ritual. No longer was the priesthood made up of all believers. Instead, the clergy had become the elite core, distinct from the laity, with special spiritual powers of its own. After all of this, in 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius repealed Constantine's Edict of Milan, which effectively repealed the religious freedom, and established Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Theodosius announced all who dissent would be punished in accordance with the celestial will. The martyrs had become the inquisitors, a development that was clearly anti-scriptural, which would turn out to be a catastrophe for both Christianity and progress towards civil liberty. This marriage perverted both the church and the state, which would coincide with Lord Acton's dictum, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The reason for this is because we are men, and we as men have a sinful, fallen nature. That nature is magnified when it is part of a human institution. The question is then posed, what is more dangerous, a man without a gang or a man with a gang? From this point, we can see the spread of the Roman Catholic Church to become the predominant religion of many countries, such as France, with the conversion of King Clovis in 511 AD. Spain and Portugal, which started with the Reconquista in 718 and finally ended in 1492 under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, when they finally defeated the Moors and the Muslims and pushed them out of Spain. And the British as well. Now, Britain is a unique case because they can trace their Catholic roots as far back as the 2nd century, when Augustine of Canterbury arrived in 597 AD, and within 90 years all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England had accepted Catholicism as their religion. It wasn't until the 16th century that Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine and to marry Anne. I want to be clear about this. It's not Mary Anne, but he wanted to get married to a woman named Anne. That England had broke away from the Catholic Church and became known as the Church of England. But it still held the framework of the Roman Catholic Church government, liturgy, and customs while holding on to the fundamentals of faith of the Protestant Reformation. Due to the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church that took root all the way back in Constantine's time, as well as the perversion of the Church, there were many that broke off from what many saw in their time as a corrupted church to keep their faith pure and not to be tempted to compromise by the lure of money. There were people who followed St. Anthony into the desert of Egypt to live their lives in poverty and chastity and to escape the corruption of the church. There were other groups such as the Paulicians, the Anti-Dichotomarians, and the Jovians, to name a few, all who, before the Protestant Reformation, broke away from the church due to what they believed corruption taking place. Ultimately, they, along with men like Peter Waldo, John Wycliffe, and Jan Hus, were all the forerunners for the Protestant Reformation. Then, on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nails his famous 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Church, and thanks to the invention of the printing press in 1440, his thesis was spread throughout Germany in 1518 and England and France in 1519. He directly influenced John Calvin, who in turn wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which influenced many people, and both of these events ultimately led to the Protestant faction of the church. Now, all that being said, the incestuous relationship that took place between the crown and the church, whether it was at Rome, France, Spain, or even Britain, only brought tyranny and death, and not liberty and freedom. Many, and not all, but many of the atrocities are outlined in Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was written in 1563. This persecution is ultimately what led the Pilgrims to flee the persecution of the church and the state, and through the discovery of Columbus, they shifted their eyes to the west, toward the New World, a primitive and free area where they believed that they could start anew, free from the tyranny of the marriage of the state and the church. Next time on PMS, we're going to take a look at the Pilgrims.